Okay, part two, Thomas Jefferson. Um, Between the time of the election in November 1800 and Thomas Jefferson taking office in 1801, John Adams and the Federalists in the government are going to attempt to thwart Jefferson's presidency before he even becomes president. It's called the Midnight Judges, the Midnight Judges. Before Jefferson takes office, the Congress passes what's called the Judiciary Act of 1801. What it does is it increases the number of circuit courts from 6 to 16. That means now there would be a federal judge in every single state. Okay, if to give you some idea about the significance of these circuit courts, today we have 13 circuit courts. We have 13 circuit courts. So the circuit courts, which are basically federal judges who drive a circuit, they go a circuit, right? I think the circuit court for the state of Tennessee is in it's either Cleveland or Cincinnati, in Ohio. That's the center of the circuit court, the headquarters. So what that does is it puts 10 more Federalist judges on the bench who can make federal decisions about legislation that gets passed. Also, since John Jay had to resign from the Supreme Court in order to run for president, the one vacancy on the Supreme Court exists. So Adams and the Congress, instead of trying to fill that vacancy, they go ahead and eliminate the need for the vacancy by decreasing the number of justices on the Supreme Court from 6 to 5. So what they're going to do is they're going to pack the court with Federalist judges, judges that have a philosophy of government different than Thomas Jefferson, and they're going to make it so that Thomas Jefferson can't appoint a Supreme Court justice who will have his kind of ideology. Now, when March comes around, Thomas Jefferson comes into office. He chooses James Madison as his Attorney General. When Madison gets to his office, he opens a desk drawer and he finds one of these appointment letters for one of these new federal judges in the drawer. It had not been delivered to the Senate for confirmation. Madison refuses to send the document, and he drafts a new document to appoint a Republican judge to that position. Now, Marbury, knowing that he's supposed to become a federal judge, is now going to petition the Supreme Court to force Madison to deliver his documents, to force Madison to deliver those documents. It's at this point, during this Judiciary Act, that the Supreme Court comes into its own. It finally establishes its jurisdiction and what its purpose is. Okay? What the judiciary decides is that the Supreme Court doesn't handle court cases. It handles questions of constitutionality with regard to legislation. So the decision over whether or not Madison is forced to turn over Marbury's letter to the Senate, for them, isn't under discussion. What they're going to decide is whether the Judiciary Act of 1801 is constitutional or not. Because according to their review of the legislation, it appears that the Adams administration is attempting to thwart Jefferson's presidency before he even becomes president. They're attempting to hobble him before he can even start doing a single thing. Sort of trying to establish some kind of, I don't know what you would call it, a deep state maybe. Some kind of government entity that will work in resistance to constantly attempt to thwart an incoming president so that he can't get anything accomplished. Usually not going to be successful, but this is what was going to be tried. The Supreme Court declared those actions unconstitutional. So what happens? We go back to only having 6 circuit courts. Those 10 federal judges lose their positions. We also go back to having 6 members of the Supreme Court. So when Thomas Jefferson takes office, he is able to appoint a new member to the Supreme Court. like he was supposed to be able to. The significance of Marbury versus Madison is this fact that it establishes the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court establishes its limits for what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to answer to questions of constitutionality. And that's where this notion, this principle of judicial review comes into play. Now, in 1799, Napoleon again in power in France. England and France, of course, are at war again. 1800, the Mississippi River is America's western boundary. 1763, the Treaty of Paris gave all of the land west of the Mississippi to the Spanish, took the Louisiana Territory away from the French and gave it to the Spanish. Now, the Spanish have proven not to be complicated neighbors. They don't send a lot of people. Their primary focus is on making sure New Orleans stays safe. Okay? The only powerful presence is in New Orleans. Now, in the 1790s, the Spanish try to get the Americans to come across the border, come across the river, and settle in Spanish territory. That will have a tendency to basically produce more commerce for New Orleans. And so this idea of the Spaniards inviting Americans to come across, this is how people start winding up in places like East Texas. During this period, the Spanish allow us to have free navigation of the Mississippi River and access to the ports in New Orleans. So everything is good at this point. And by 1801, there is a sizable American minority on the other side of the Mississippi River, which is significant at this point. Now, publicly, Jefferson has to be against it. Jefferson has to say, if you leave the boundaries of the United States of America and you travel across the Mississippi River, you are no longer in America. You are now in Spanish territory. This country, you are a part of the Kingdom of Spain. And so publicly, Jefferson's against it. However, privately, he says, I wish 100,000 Americans would go across the border. Because if we did, then it would be much easier for us to sort of appropriate the territory. The specter of war was not unreal. And so in 1801, 1802, we send, it's a mistake, it's always a mistake when we do it, we send John Jay to get a treaty with the Spanish with regard to the Mississippi River. What happens? When John Jay gets back trying to get a treaty, Spain revokes Americans' rights to ship goods on the Mississippi River. When will we ever learn not to send John Jay on these kinds of missions? The Federalists start talking about taking the city of New Orleans by force. Right? The Federalists are willing to go to war to capture the New Orleans from the Spanish, because after all, they're weak in the region. They don't have a lot of territory. They don't have a lot of individuals there in the region. So, Jefferson, even though he wants access to New Orleans, he hears a rumor, since he has so many friends in France at this point, he hears a rumor that Spain may be selling Louisiana back to the French. Secretly, of course. See, the problem is Napoleon is running roughshod all over Europe. And he's upset with the Portuguese. And so Napoleon is invading into Spain so he can get access to the Portuguese. And wherever he goes in Spain, he conquers territory and incorporates it into his empire. The Spanish, in an effort to stop Napoleon, offered a peace treaty that they would not join the alliance that is being built by the other European powers to thwart his plans. Plus, they would surrender the Louisiana territory back to France in exchange for Napoleon surrendering this territory in Spain that he's captured. Well, this sounded like a good idea to Napoleon. However, for us, this could be a problem. Spain has proved to be a very weak neighbor, and we like having weak neighbors. We don't have to worry about them. The French could be another story entirely. If the French decide conquering the world, starting with Europe, is a little too difficult, then maybe they would look towards conquering America first and then going back to France. So this idea that the French would now be on our western frontiers rather than the Spanish could be problematic for us. So enter Robert R. Livingston, the American minister to France. Jefferson tells him, sends him a letter, tells him, go to the French foreign minister and try to buy New Orleans. We need to buy New Orleans because the Federalists are ready to go to war to take it. When Livingston approaches the French deny they own it. They say, Sacre bleu, this was taken from us in 1763. It now belongs to the Spanish. You should be talking to the Spanish. In my best French accent. Livingston, however, being the cunning, crafty individual that he is, makes mention that not only does he know that's untrue, he's already seen the treaty between the Spanish and the French that returns possession of the land to the French. At this point, he also mentions in passing that if America might just accidentally take it by force, if buying it is out of the question. The United States of America may just take New Orleans if we can't buy it. So, now France changed the story. What they say, though, instead of asking for a price for New Orleans, they ask, what would you give us for the entire territory? All the land adjacent to your territory, which is now called Louisiana. Now, the entire territory, that would more than double the size of our country if we took possession of Louisiana territory. From the Gulf all the way to Canada. Livingston stalls. I'm not authorized to negotiate that stuff. The French say, how about $125 million? Okay, how about $60 million? Okay, how about $15 million? Now, when they hit on $15 million, the one thing that the French don't know, that Robert Livingston does know, is that Thomas Jefferson has authorized him to spend upwards of $15 million to purchase New Orleans. To purchase New Orleans, $15 million. The French have just offered to sell the entire territory for $15 million. So Robert Livingston says, let me think about it for a moment and I'll get back to you. Jefferson is ecstatic. See, we have to put ourselves in Napoleon's shoes. Napoleon is fighting the British. And on land, Napoleon is a brilliant commander. He's a tactical genius. At sea, Britannia rules the waves. England, in their sea prowess, is far superior to the French. So the French need revenues. They need capital. They need money to continue this war. Okay? And so when the Spanish offer to give them Louisiana back, the French think of nothing better than to sell this land to the Americas so that the Americans will pay them to get a hold of all this land. Now, Jefferson and most of the Congress are ecstatic about this idea. Okay? All except for the New England states, the Federalist states. They're not happy at all. There's the territory. All of the yellow territory is this new land. And of course this Oregon territory, which is sort of a disputed claim by both the British and the Spanish at that point. Both disputed, the British and the Spanish. The Federalists don't mind taking New Orleans.
Battery's getting low, it's blinking.
Okay, I'm going to have to stop there because my battery's dying. So we will finish up the Louisiana Purchase as soon as we charge the battery. Thank you. Have a lovely, lovely day.